This is chapter 8, part 3. Let's continue on talking about some sort of general or broad models, approaches of how we explain drug abuse. First of all, we'll use the traditional model, which the textbook is referring to as a moral model. I suppose you could also, if you wanted to, you could name it something like a free choice or free agency model, something like that. What we mean by that is an explanation for drug abuse in which drug-taking behavior is attributed to personal inadequacies, overindulgence, a weakness of the will, or other serious character flaws. So, that's a little bit of a negative spin on it. We're trying to take all perspectives seriously. And so this perspective takes the view that people have free will, they make choices, and that those choices result in consequences that could be good or bad, and that drug-taking behavior and drug abuse is sort of the result of a set of choices that people have made, and that choices are also important in being able to beat dependency and addiction, that point of view. So again, it's the focus here is really on, even though the word's not used here in the drawing words from the textbook, the word choice is definitely a key term here. Now, in contrast to a choice model is really, you would say, is, we could call it a scientific model. And if the focus is on the next two models we talk about, you could really say are kind of scientific approach, which is that the behavior that you engage in is not the result of free choices, but basically it looks at human beings like the rest of nature as being pushed and pulled in different direction by external forces. So it's the idea that you're sort of a pawn on a chessboard, and where you end up on that chessboard is because you were pushed and pulled in different directions by external forces. If you think of research methods class or statistics, it's the X, the independent variable, that's determining, that's pushing the Y, the dependent variable, to the state that it's in. So the idea is there's some external factor or factors that are pushing you into drug abuse or pushing drug abusive behavior. So now if we take a disease model, that's one sort of deterministic or scientific type of model. It's an explanation for drug abuse, arguing that there is a chemical biological component to addiction, and if left untreated, it can be fatal, rendering it, like any other chronic medical condition, a disease. So it's a medical model. It's seeing the dependency, the addiction, the abuse as being a result of external factors. And a medical approach often focuses on biological, chemical, physiological, genetic types of influences over one's behavior. Could be lifestyle things too. It could be things that are more sociological or economic or psychological. But again, there's that tendency with the medical approach to focus quite a bit on the biological. This approach was sort of very similar to the disease model, but one that doesn't really take this medical language of turning behavior into something that's a symptom of illness or disease, is this biopsychosocial model. Sort of a mouthful there, but it's combining biological, psychological, and sociological perspectives and integrating those. It's the idea that the drug-taking behavior can be best accounted for through the consideration of a combination of biological, psychological, and sociological risk factors in an individual's life. So the main difference, you say, well, that sounds quite a bit like the disease model. They're both deterministic, these scientific X, cause, and Y sorts of models. What's the difference? Well, again, this one is not really, it's just trying to explain behavior. It's not classifying that behavior as a disease. So there's really kind of, in the medical model, there's a bit of a framing that it's a problem to the extent that there's something wrong with the person, there's something wrong with the organism, something's broken, disease, that the organism has been overwhelmed by negative external factors. So it kind of problematizes, it turns the behavior into a condition, that sort of a thing. This biopsychosocial model is not really judging it all, or framing it as being something that's abnormal, right? That's a disease framing makes it kind of an abnormal behavior, drug abuse. Not so with these integrated perspectives. Now, the perspective that I'm going to be focusing on in this chapter, due to only time limitations, is the biological perspective. Again, as I said earlier, make sure and cover the other perspectives as well. Specific physical mechanisms in specific individuals that influence the initial experience with drugs or an engagement in drug abuse over a period of time. So you're just talking about the kind of, it's basically brain science. What sort of neurotransmitters are in the brain are affected by a given drug that has entered the brain through the bloodstream, and how do those, so it's focusing on a chemical level, on a neural level, meaning the nerves of the brain, brain nerves, and how neurochemicals, drugs influence different regions of the brain, that kind of thing. So the focus is on the brain, the focus is on chemicals, biochemicals, the sort of chemical and biological, physiological effect of these drugs on the brain. Biological theories have focused primarily on a number of factors: genetic factors, physiological factors, and neurochemical systems in the brain. So basically, we're talking about how the brain is wired, how it's functioning, and of course, the genetic part of that is that genes are in control of the development of brain cells and development of cells in general, and the way those cells function. Genes make protein products that are used to build and maintain cells and maintain the functioning of those cells. And different genes produce slightly different protein products that make the brain work a little differently if you have different variations of certain genes. So that's kind of the role that genes play. But again, the focus here is what's how the brain's operating, how it's wired, how it's functioning. While environmental factors are important, recent studies have shown that genetic factors play an equal or even greater role when we're talking about drug abuse, dependency, addiction. Now, I think I actually listed a little bit later, but I'll just say it now just to make sure that I get it out there, that the textbook is not specific about this, but the genetic studies that try to pin down what percent of drug abuse, dependency, addiction is due to the differences in people's genes, person to person, individual to individual. And most of these genetic studies put this term heritability, which means how much is the genetic influence. They put the heritability at about 50-60%, depending on what you're looking at, but it's usually half or more of the story is explained through how we differ from each other genetically, from individual to individual. So that's a big 50 or 60% of the story, is a pretty big chunk of explaining why is it that some people become dependent on drugs and others do not. So it's definitely in this area of drug abusive, drug taking behavior. Genetic influence is very strong. It doesn't mean it's the only influence, and it doesn't mean it's deterministic, where if you have a certain gene, guaranteed that you're going to become a drug addict or something like that. It's not like that. We're talking about risk factors. We're talking about the chances of developing drug dependency, the odds, the probability. So genes affect the risk, the probability that you develop these disorders. Studies of different strains of mice and rats, for example, have found that some of them have a genetic propensity to become dependent upon cocaine, whereas other strains are more susceptible to the dependence-producing effects of opiates. So that's just animal studies that are showing genetic influence, differences that different individuals, or in this case, different varieties of mice or rats, whatever it is, the animal that's being studied, that those varieties, those strains, can have differences in their how they respond to drugs. So that these animal studies then get sort of applied, or they're suggestive of what's going on in the human brain, because at that physical, genetic, and chemical cellular level, humans are surprisingly, or really impressively similar at that level to, say, mice or rats or other animals. Most studies concerning genetic factors in humans have focused on alcoholic individuals, and a growing research literature indicates that alcoholism has a strong genetic component, a heritability, I mentioned this term before, of 50 or 60%. And that's pretty typical for all these different kinds of drugs. That heritability number is impressively high, higher than was thought previously in the past. So this sort of importance of genes has become more appreciated over time. Family studies have shown that children of alcoholics are 4 times more likely than other children to become alcoholics. Identical twins who are going to be exactly the same genetically, they're genetic clones of each other, they're more likely to have a similar risk for alcoholism than fraternal twins. These are twins who grow and develop in the same womb at the same time, but are genetically no more similar than just regular brother, siblings, brothers and sisters. So identical twins much more similar to each other on risk for alcohol or other kinds of drug dependency, which shows that, so it's one way of pointing to the importance of genetic influence. So that's just, we don't have time to get into the details of that, but all the different kinds of studies, adoption studies, the more sophisticated recent studies which look at specific genetic variants, they all point to the same story of the genetic influence being important. Children who have at least one alcoholic biological parent and were adopted by a non-alcoholic parent are 3 times more likely to have a problem with alcohol, even when they have been raised in a low-risk environment. So we can see that's just another way. There's many different methods that are used in these studies that have revealed the importance of genetic influence. Like cancer and heart disease, alcoholism is considered to be genetically complex genes. So we don't want to be overly simplistic about this. One gene never has much influence on an outcome, on, say, something like drug abuse behavior. One gene has a trivial influence on anything. But humans have around 20,000 genes. And so if you have 1,000 genes that play a role, even if each one is a tiny trivial role, you add up all of those, and then the genetic influence gets to be quite sizable. In the case of alcoholism, genes are likely to be associated with liver enzymes that metabolize or break down alcohol, as well as specific patterns of brain chemistry. We are speaking of a predisposition towards alcohol misuse, which can increase the probability of alcoholism. So we just want to choose our language carefully, that we're not talking here about you have a bad gene that guaranteed that you're going to develop alcoholism. No. It's much more complicated than that. Again, we need to speak in terms of influences, probabilities, likelihoods, not any sort of purely deterministic kind of model. People differ in the extent to which chemicals in the body are broken down or changed in some way to allow us to function normally. Heroin-dependent individuals appear to behave as if they have a metabolic imbalance with respect to opioids or opiate-related drugs in general. So here we're talking about why some individuals are more vulnerable to drugs than others, is that you have differences in the body chemistry, metabolic imbalance. We're just talking about the balance of chemicals in your body, biochemicals, and people are different on those person to person. Amphetamines, cocaine, heroin, alcohol, and nicotine may be very different from a pharmacological standpoint. Okay, so at a chemical level, the structure is quite different, one drug to the next, but the way that people and animals react to them are remarkably similar. So you can see this points to a system in the brain which tends to respond to different drugs in kind of a similar fashion. Let's go ahead and pick this up in part 4.